Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. We have a new project in the shop today, one that I have been wanting to tackle for a little while now, and an opportunity has presented itself to me, so I'm going to jump into the deep end of the pool here. What I have here in front of me is a raw casting made by Denis Foster. I found him on the Practical Machinists forum for an 18-inch machinist straight edge, sometimes also referred to as a prism straight edge because it has that 45-degree angle front face. I've been wanting to get into machine way scraping, and the first thing that you really need to do that is, well, you need to learn how to scrape, and you also need a reference, a flat reference. A friend of mine has offered to give me and a couple of other folks a 2-day crash course in machine scraping, and I'm going to take this piece with me as my class project. That means I need to get all of the machining done on this piece before class starts, and that is not going to be as easy as it sounds. Denis, who cast the straight edge, has been invaluable in giving me some good information and some ideas on how to work hold this on the Bridgeport. He suggested I start with machining the sole, or the bottom of the straight edge. I have these two setup blocks that are machined to the same height that I'm going to set the prism face on, and that will end up holding the sole at a 45-degree angle to the vertical axis of the head. Of course, that's going to mean that I'm going to nod the head at 45 degrees in order to mill this surface. So, getting some advice from Denis and from some others, I've come up with what I think should be a reasonable approach to work holding this on the mill table. I'll use these toe clamps and some risers to clamp the straight edge down on top of those two milled setup blocks. Trying to be, careful as to how much pressure I put on these clamps. I don't want to warp the straight edge to the point where once I mill it and then I release the clamps, that it ends up turning into a banana. Even though this is a raw casting, I want to minimize how skewed this is on the table. So I'm just using this machinist square to kind of get an idea of how straight it is in relationship to one of the T-slots. I have this digital angle finder, and I'm going to use it to help me nod the head to 45 degrees. With the angle finder zeroed now attached to the quill, I can loosen these 3 bolts on the side of the machine and then adjust the worm here to where the head is at 45 degrees. course, now with the head knotted, it's pushed the working end of the quill too far back. So now I'm loosening the bolts that hold the ram in place, and I'm going to push that out all the way until it's at the extent of its travel forward. With the head knotted and the ram all the way forward, the quill still isn't in a working position over the straight edge. So I now need to move the table all the way back. Trying to find a position here where I can have the quill extended as little as possible and still be able to be in a decent working range. I think if I move the knee up considerably, that will let me move the table back forward some, and I won't have to have the quill extended so far to do the machining. Well, I don't have a face mill that's big enough to machine this surface, so I'm going to end up using my fly cutter that I made some time ago. Now this has some pluses and minuses. It's going to take me a lot longer to machine this because I won't be able to take as heavy of a cut, but I think that's also the plus. Because I'm going to be taking lighter cuts, I'm less likely to have an issue with this moving on the work surface. Well, after installing the fly cutter and the spindle, it was obvious that this is not at 45 degrees, if in fact that digital angle finder was at least a little bit accurate. And that's okay, it's a rough casting, and I didn't expect the angle between the sole and the prism face to be exactly 45 degrees. But what I am going to do is adjust the angle of the head so that the fly cutter will at least give me as flat of a cut from front to back as I can get. Once I flip this back around and machine the prism face, I can readjust the head to 45 degrees to get an accurate, or at least a reasonably accurate, angle on the front prism face. Well, the more I looked at this setup and the more conversations I had with folks on Practical Machinists, the more I didn't like it. So I'm going to change some things up here rather than clamping these directly to those setup blocks. I have some other setup blocks here that are a bit wider than the ones that I made, and I have these little brass half domes. And I think I'm going to try to use this as a plane. And what I mean by that is the principle that any 3 points will make up a plane. I'm going to use these half spheres as a way of defining those 3 points and rest the prism face on it. That will ensure that the prism face is in a level plane. With this face sitting on 3 points, it should remove any opportunity for the straight edge, for the casting itself to twist or warp under the pressure of the clamps. Or at least that's the theory. Now I need to swap out the studs here for these strap clamps because they're too short, but the challenge now is going to be to place those clamps so they're directly over top of those domes. And while I'm at it, I'm going to take some 1, 2, 3 blocks and set them on the back strap here of the straight edge and clamp those down. This will give me a positive stop. So if I do ever need to pull the straight edge out for whatever reason, I should be able to replace it back into the exact same spot it was in. This will also give me a little bit of assurance that the straight edge isn't moving under the forces of the fly cutter. Of course, trying to do this and keeping the straight edge, which weighs about 18 pounds, balanced on those 3 points has been a challenge, to say the least. With those backstops now secure, it should be a little easier for me to place the straight edge on those domes and get it balanced and clamped down. And when I mean should be easier, what I really meant was I would like it to be easier, because it's been anything but easier. Well, I'm going to give up on using those little brass domes. It just wasn't going to work. So I'm going to clamp the straight edge straight down to these setup blocks and trust that I'll be able to control any warping with how much pressure I put on these clamps. Okay, well, I think I'm ready to try to take a first cut. So I'm going to take just a few thousandths of a cut here and go over slowly to see how well everything is aligned. I'm noticing here on the trailing edge of the fly cutter that I am getting a deeper cut, I think, in the rear than I was in the front. And that's a little bit concerning to me. What that's telling me is my head is not trammed left and right as much as I thought it was. So I think I'm going to need to pause here and see what we can do to adjust that. I'm not going to bore you with the procedure of tramming this head and how I'm going to do it. So off camera, I'm going to set up a dial indicator on the spindle and see what I need to do to touch this over just a little bit more so that I get a good even cut. Well, with the head now trimmed in, I think you might be able to see here how the trailing cut is just barely making a mark there. You can actually see a crosshatch pattern that it's leaving behind it, and that tells me really that this head is trimmed in perfectly. And really the reason why this is so important is if the head is not trimmed just perfectly, you'll end up dishing out the material. So I would end up taking more material out of the center of the straight edge than I would the back or the front, and that just adds to the time that it takes to scrape it flat. You can also see here that I've added some tattletales here to the left and the right end of the straight edge. And all this is going to do for me is ensure that this piece doesn't move. With both dials set at 0, if there's any movement in this piece whatsoever, either forward or back or left and right, it'll show up on these dials. And if I were to notice anything dramatic or even just a little bit, it will give me an opportunity to stop what I'm doing and readjust the piece as necessary to get it back in alignment. Probably unnecessary, but I am starting all of the cuts from the left side of the straight edge. So I'm using the rapid to move the table back over to the right. So I'm starting at the same starting point. Once I get here, I will raise the knee and move the table to where I'm effectively taking off about a 15 thousandths cut on each pass. Well, at this point, I've made quite a few more passes down the sole of the straight edge to the point where it is nearly cleaned up of all raw casting. According to Denis, the maker of the casting, I have about 125 thousandths that I could take off of the sole, and there still be plenty of meat left on the straight edge. So I'm going to continue to make passes down this until the sole is completely cleaned up, and I have also cleaned up some of the front edge here of the straight edge. Well, I think I have the sole here cleaned up as well as I'm going to get it with roughing passes. So now I'm going to remove this standard carbide insert and replace it with one that is generally designed for aluminum and brass. It has a much sharper cutting edge, so it should give me a better surface finish. I'll take a couple of finishing passes of about 5,000, step the cut, but I'm also going to slow the feed rate down considerably. This is coming up to the end here of the second pass with the ground insert, and quite frankly I could not be happier with the surface finish. I'm going to take one or two more finishing passes, but before I do, I'm going to loosen the clamps here on the back of the straight edge. I'm going to loosen them until it's loose and then just snug them down. There's enough holding this thing in place that I'm not worried about it moving, but this should relieve any kind of internal twist that might have been introduced by the pressure of the clamps. Well, after those finishing passes, not only does it look great, but it feels great. So I think I'm going to go for broke, although I feel pretty confident. Go ahead and remove this from the clamps, and we'll take it over to the surface plate and do a little inspection on it. I cleaned off my surface plate and the bottom of the straight edge. We'll just drop it on there, and surprisingly it's actually hitting at least partially where I would expect it to, but it's not anywhere near perfect. The smallest feeler gauge I have is 1.5 thousandths, and I can't get it underneath any part of the surface plate, front, side, or back. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think that I did a good job in getting this machine flat. It's still pretty high in the center, but the sides are less than 1.5 thousandths off of the height of the center. So I don't think I'm going to have to spend a ton of time scraping the bottom. Well, this video is ending up much longer than I expected to, so I'm going to wrap this one up here for now. Well, if you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button so you'll be notified when part 2 is published. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.